Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks for being with us on this beautiful evening. I'm Mark Nykirk, the director of the Scripps Howard Center for Civic Engagement at NKU. Our center is the host of the 6 at 6 lecture series, and really appreciate you being with us for this final lecture and this season. We've had 10 lectures. Just a quick note on the origins of the name. When we started, we had 6 in a season. So it's still 6 at 6, but now we have 10 lectures. So thanks for being with us. This has been a special season. We have focused on Black history and culture, and all of our lectures we have archived. So if you go to the 6 at 6 website and you missed one, or you want to see it again, or tell people about it, you can do that at the archive, and hope that we can get kind of a second life out of those videos as what else would you want to watch during the summer other than one of these excellent lectures again? So we are live from the Southgate Street School in Newport, and I will invite Scott Clark in just a moment to tell you about this special place, but suffice it to say that there's a remarkable history here of education of the Black children of Campbell County, and so it's been especially wonderful to be able to broadcast from this location on this topic. I want to say a few thank yous to people that you don't see, but who helped make this happen. Behind the camera tonight is Jordan Barget. Jordan is a student at NKU in electronic media and broadcast, and he is with Norse Media. Norse Media is a co-curricular activity for students who are in this field, and what we're hoping by having the Norse Media students with us this season is to give them some real world training and how to produce electronic broadcast, but also in the Zoom world. A lot of the jobs that they'll be moving to will involve using this kind of live streaming technology. So it's another of the educational components of 6 at 6 that you may not think about, but that we value. And so also with us all season has been Chris Strobel, who teaches in that program and is the faculty advisor to Norse Media, doing a lot of the technical things behind the scene that make this work. So thank you, Chris. You also don't see my colleague in the Scripps Howard Center, Felicia Scher, who helps with some production things. And so thank you, Felicia. And our other colleague, Melanie Hartzell, is taking a night off tonight, but Melanie and Felicia have been invaluable as we've moved through this season. Also, I want to say a special thank you to our partners who have been with us this season. In a normal season, we are in the community. The idea of 6 at 6 is that there is an amazing amount of research at a university by faculty and students, and can we take that out of Highland Heights and take it into the community? So we have been at the Baker Hunt in Covington, the Behringer Crawford in Covington, the Mercantile Library in downtown Cincinnati, the Campbell County Library in Fort Thomas, on campus at NKU, and at Carnegie Center also in Covington. But COVID meant we had to go virtual, and so we came up with the idea of doing this live from the Southgate Street School. But I want to thank all of our live partners. We're working on our plans now for the coming season, and hoping to get back with you all in person in some fashion. So meanwhile, we've had some additional partners this season who have been with us. The Northern Kentucky Forum, the Northern Kentucky History Tour, Thomas More University. So we appreciate all of that, and the Friends of Music Hall. And I want to call out especially a partnership this season with the Holocaust and Humanities Center, which is in the same building as the Museum Center, the old Union Terminal. A remarkable museum that opened in 2019 to tell the story of the Holocaust at one level, but it's more than that. And now that we're able to go to things again, go see this museum, take your friends to see it. It is just an astounding place. And one of the things that happens at the Holocaust Center is there's a theme that runs through it, and that theme has to do with being an upstander. If you think about the Holocaust, there were those who were the perpetrators, Hitler and his people, who brought this, and there were bystanders who looked on and did nothing. And there were upstanders who said, this is something we can't tolerate and I will stand against it. The museum asked you at the end of the tour, are you an upstander in 2021? What cause matters to you for which you will stand up? So think about that in the context of us being here tonight at Southgate Street School, where a community stood up and said, at a time when other places in the South were trying to close schools and worried about the danger of educating the sons and daughters of slaves and free the children of freed blacks, and resisted anything that had to do with education. This is a community where both the Black citizens and the white citizens said, let's build a school. And I'm going to let Scott Clark, who is with the city of Newport as historic preservation officer, and in his kind of secondary job, the director of this new museum, still fairly new, still under construction. We've had a lot of students who've worked here, helped build the exhibits. So it's been a great partnership, and we're thankful to the city. And Scott, if you could just say a word.
Thank you, Mark. So as Mark said, I'm Scott Clark. I'm the executive director of the museum here. And first of all, I want to say we really value our relationship with Northern Kentucky University, especially with the Scripps Howard Center for Civic Engagement, to allow us to be able to be the host for the last 10 lectures here in our Southgate Street School. This school was quite an incredible place. This site has always been, since 1870, a site of education for Black children in the city of Newport and also in Campbell County. It was the only school in the county. Bear in mind the fact that this school was established as a one-room schoolhouse in 1873, after the city had made the commitment, just years after the Black man got the vote in the United States, to educate children here on this location. The building that we're in now dates back to 1893, with the forethought that the idea was not just to educate students in a one-room school, but to educate grades initially 1 through 12 within these walls. Eventually, the practical aspects of it became grades 1 through 8. But if you've been to our museum, been to this building, you'll see that it's a fairly modest building. And yet hundreds of children were educated here on a daily basis. And the building bears marks of the footsteps of the stairs up and down for 80 years of education. Also, the forethought for empowering these children, that the value of education, the value of being yourself and of excelling in life. Still, students were taught to dream and dream big, and that you could go on to college, you could have a life in the military, you could be whomever you wanted to be. And those students did succeed and show people that by going on to contribute to the community, to contribute to science and to education. And then in 1955, amazingly, right after the decision for Brown versus Board of Education was handed down, that said separate but equal was not equal, this school desegregated. And the students literally crossed the color line, went down to the regular elementary school and integrated into the schools, including the educators. And so without any incident, without any problems within the community, and it was, again, the power of telling the children and the community how important education was here. So I will fast forward a little bit. We're very proud of our museum here. Before COVID, we were accustomed to being able to hold talks such as this within our meeting rooms. We're working towards that, being able to do that in the future. Look for us this summer as we reopen our museum, and also for our Arts and Music Festival that will be the first weekend of October here at the Southgate Street School Museum, sponsored by the city of Newport. So Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm looking forward to our topic. It should be extremely interesting, as they all have been, and very pertinent for the times that we're in. So I'm going to turn it back over to Mark to introduce our speaker. And once again, thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in person sometime soon.
Thank you, Scott. And I just remind the audience at the bottom of your screen on your webinar, you'll see the Q&A function. If you have questions, please post them there and we'll get those to our speaker at the end. And I just want to remind you again of that word from the Holocaust Museum of upstander, and think about what Scott told you about what happened here. We stand in the space where upstanders stood. Our speaker this evening is Brandon Winford, a history professor at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. He is joining us remotely from Knoxville. He is a historian of the 19th and 20th century of the United States and African-American experience. And he particularly focuses on the relationship between civil rights and capitalism. He has a book, John Hervey Wheeler, Black Banking and the Economic Struggle for Civil Rights. It was published by the University Press of Kentucky, which is a consortium press of the public universities and many of the private universities in the state. NKU is a member of it, and a very well-regarded press in that sector, and really the only consortium press of public and private universities in the country. So I'm proud to be a member of the press and proud to have published this book. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Winford, and we'll be back with, just remember to put those questions in the Q&A, and thank you.
Good evening. I got ahead of myself right there. Can everyone hear me and see me okay?
Yes, indeed.
Good. So before I begin, I'm going to be looking off to the left. So if it looks like I'm looking elsewhere, I have my PowerPoint with another screen, so I'll be back and forth. Once again, good evening. Thank you for the introduction, Mark. Before I begin my talk, I'd like to thank everyone involved in coordinating tonight's talk, particularly the Scripps Howard Center, Felicia Scher for being more directly involved in coordinating the talk on my end. Thank you all for your efforts tonight. So glad to hear about the work that you all are doing. So fascinating, really, to see the collaborative effort as it relates to public history and the efforts to really preserve these histories that we're so accustomed to not really hearing about. I also like to thank all of the sponsors for coordinating this event. I know how important having that kind of support is for these events. And thank you all, in terms of the audience, thank you all for taking time out of your schedule to be here as well. You could have been anywhere, but you decided to join in this particular Zoom session. The title of my talk, once again, I'm Brandon Winford, Associate Professor of History at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. The title of my talk this evening is Black Business Activism in the Mid-20th Century South. And it really focuses in on my book, John Hervey Wheeler, Black Banking and the Economic Struggle for Civil Rights, which I'll talk about. But before I do that, I want to start with one of my favorite anecdotes, and I'm going to apologize in advance for the colorful language. So this anecdote was told to Nathan Garrett, who was an accountant in Durham, retired accountant in Durham, by his father, York Garrett Jr., who was a druggist who came to the Bull City during the 1930s. And it goes a little something like this. A gentleman who was a prospective borrower walked into the lobby of the Mechanics and Farmers Bank, which you see pictured here in downtown Durham on West Parish Street, otherwise known as the Black Wall Street. He had an appointment to meet with Richard Lewis McDougall, the bank's cashier. As usual, when considering whether the bank should loan someone money, Richard McDougall began the interview, firing off question after question, all the while sizing up the man for potential risks for the bank. After some time of questions, the man turned the tables around on McDougall. "Hey, Mr. McDougall," the man said, "you got a toilet in your house?" "Why, yes," answered McDougall. "You probably have a bathroom or a bathtub in there," the man continued. "Why, yes," says McDougall, probably now puzzled at the line of questioning. "Did you take a bath this morning?" the man went on. "Yeah, I took a bath this morning." "Well, I'm sure glad to hear it," the applicant concluded, "because apparently I'm going to have to kiss your ass in order to get this loan." While this is an entertaining exchange, and hopefully you got a chuckle out of that, it captures the reality of the Black bank as an institution that was interested in its bottom line, its profitability. It highlights what people saw as the bank's conservative business practices. This anecdote also suggests that there could be some resentment on the part of Black folk in Durham, many of whom went to the bank for loans but came up short. Yet these people had supported the bank and helped it grow to over $700,000 in resources by the end of 1929. At the same time, when we examine the history of Black banking in particular and Black business more generally, it reveals a kind of duality that was familiar in that these institutions had to balance a concern for making money while also using their positions as banks to fulfill a commitment to the Black community. In this way, Richard Lewis McDougall had the following motto, quote, "Take care of the community and the community will take care of you." He believed that the banker is the key man of the community, and he should create a feeling in the community that above everything else, he intends to serve the community's best interests. It was Richard Lewis McDougall and others who provided John Hervey Wheeler with a training ground in what I like to refer to as Black business activism. The term captures their engagement in the broader economic struggle for civil rights, which they articulated as the interconnectedness between racial equality and economic justice. And McDougall was one of those Black business people who also believed political participation was important to citizenship, to the citizenship rights of Blacks and their survival in American society. In December 1930, for example, he urged an audience at the Negro Citizens League of Charlotte to make, quote, "use of the power of the vote as a means of gaining more consideration and privilege in the exercising of his wishes and desires," unquote. When John Wheeler moved to Durham in 1929, a few months before the stock market crash in October, McDougall became a supervisor at the bank and one of his mentors for the next 15 years. In many ways, John Wheeler learned Black business activism directly from McDougall and people like Charles Clinton Spalding, who was the president of the Mechanics and Farmers Bank from 1953 to 1952, or from 1923, to 1952. So this evening, I'm going to give a brief overview of the book. I'm going to introduce you to John Hervey Wheeler. Then I'm going to get us thinking a little bit about the broader history of Black banking in the South in particular, in the United States more broadly, while considering the role of bankers such as John Wheeler in the Black freedom struggle. That role has often been marginalized or rendered unimportant. Finally, I'd like to give an example of John H. Wheeler as a Black business activist who fought for full citizenship through an economic lens. In this way, I'm going to pull from chapter 5 of my book that focuses in on the direct action during the sit-in movement in 1960. And so I'm going to suggest to you that as we continue to consider the goals and objectives of the civil rights movement more broadly in terms of economic rights, it demands a closer examination of Black banking and business. So just a little bit about the book. The book is the first study about one of the leading Black business people and civil rights leaders in North Carolina and one of the United States' most well-known Black Wall Streets. We rarely get a glimpse of what Black business in these places actually looked like after World War II. Here we see how these leaders actually envisioned the continuation of Black business and Black institutions in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, which reveals why they embraced the Black freedom struggle to begin with. Second, the book is grounded in new archival research, from the John Hervey Wheeler collection housed at the Atlanta University Center, Robert W. Woodruff Library in Atlanta, Georgia. Third, the book explores the role of Black business people and shows exactly why someone like Wheeler became involved in the Black freedom struggle, despite all signs pointing to the possible demise of these institutions with the coming of integration. This challenges previously held ideas and myths that Black business people rejected integration because it threatened their own success. To the contrary, because they didn't have an exclusive clientele in Black customers, meaning they had to continue to compete with their white counterparts for customers, they believed their businesses would expand and thrive even more if they had complete access to the larger marketplace. Finally, the book provides a behind-the-scenes perspective of Black leadership, in this case, a Black business leader who actually played a monumental role in the Black struggle for freedom on a larger scale than we tend to believe. This is someone who had standing with the national civil rights leaders and was himself the president of the leading civil rights organization in the South, the Southern Regional Council from 1964 until 1969. And so John Wheeler had legal, political, and economic expertise that he used to shape the region's future and make what I call New South prosperity possible on a larger scale through seeing that every Southerner had an opportunity to make sure the region would prosper, grow, and survive amid the turmoil of the 1960s and beyond. More recently, on October 15, 2019, the federal courthouse on Chapel Hill Street in Durham was renamed the John Hervey Wheeler United States Courthouse. I think I have an image at the end of the presentation of that ceremony. So, what's John Hervey Wheeler's relationship to Black business before he came to work for the Mechanics and Farmers Bank in 1929? Well, you might say John Hervey Wheeler was born into Black business. He was born on New Year's Day, 1908. Interestingly enough, he was born the same year that the Mechanics and Farmers Bank opened. His parents, who you see pictured here, John Leonidas and Margaret Hervey Wheeler, moved the family to Durham that summer when John Leonidas accepted a position as an insurance agent with the North Carolina Mutual and Provident Association, which is now the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company. And I should note that both John and Margaret Wheeler were both from Nicholasville, Kentucky. And I write about this in the first chapter of my book and the sort of post-Reconstruction period. One of the fascinating things about Margaret Hervey was when she recounted her life story, she was proud of the fact that she had attended a school that had been founded by Berea College founder John G. Fee, because it was founded on the sort of principles of racial equality. She was proud of that fact. And I should note that both John Hervey or John Leonidas Wheeler, his father, and Margaret Hervey Wheeler, both were early graduates of Wilberforce University in Ohio as well. Between 1898 and 1908, the Wheelers were educators and they taught at Kittrell College in Kittrell, North Carolina, which is a school that was founded by the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which also controlled Wilberforce University. Margaret Hervey taught sewing in the industrial department and would have also had a hand in training the women students in the ideals of Black womanhood espoused by Kittrell College and the AME Church. By 1908, John Leonidas became president of Kittrell College. While in Kittrell, John Leonidas dabbled in business. He and John R. Hawkins, the education secretary for the AME Church, started the American Union Industrial Company and the American Union Benefit Association. John Leonidas' educator colleagues believed him to be foolish to leave the education profession for what they believed to be a corrupt field of business. And this is an image of one of the buildings, Allen Building on Kittrell College campus. Image on the right. If you see on the far right, the man kind of standing out by himself, that's John Leonidas. John Leonidas began his career with the North Carolina Mutual in July 1908. While the family lived in Durham, John Leonidas worked in the North Carolina Mutual's Raleigh office until being called to work in the home office as a bookkeeper in Durham, which you see pictured here. At the time John Leonidas began his work for the North Carolina Mutual, the insurance company neared its 10th year in operation. Its premium income in 1909 was $220,000. It had admitted assets of nearly $73,000 and insurance in force of over $1.5 million. And so the Wheeler family stayed in Durham for the next 4 years, at which point John Leonidas received a promotion. And so in 1912, they moved to Atlanta, Georgia, where he took over the North Carolina Mutual office. The North Carolina Mutual's Atlanta office was located on Sweet Auburn Avenue, another sort of Black Wall Street, which was the commercial hub of Black Atlanta at the time. The North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company entered Georgia the year before. So John Hervey Wheeler had a front row seat when it came to Black business. And in many ways, this explains his understanding of the importance of full citizenship to Black economic life. The Wheeler family regularly hosted John Leonidas' business associates in their home, especially North Carolina Mutual founders John Merrick and Dr. Aaron McDuffie Moore. And John Wheeler observed, later on as an adult, he observed, quote, although he was a man of few words, Dr. Moore's brain appeared to be a constant beehive of activity, and his personality indicated a constant searching for truth and for new and better ways of doing things. For a youngster 10 years old, these experiences left upon me a lasting impression of the all-inclusive manner in which Mr. Merrick and Dr. Moore worked so hard to place the company on a firm footing. The two men, he said, were in every sense of the word social engineers, possessed with a oneness of purpose and exercised a strong influence upon my life as well as upon the lives of countless others. So John Hervey Wheeler and his two sisters, he had an older sister, Ruth Hervey Wheeler, and he had a younger sister, Marjorie Janice Wheeler. They came of age in Jim Crow, Atlanta, Georgia. Wheeler often said that he, quote, started off life even from an economic standpoint. And this was true, as the Wheeler children attended the public schools until 7th grade in Atlanta, because there was no public school for Black Atlantans beyond 7th grade until 1924, when the city built Booker T. Washington High School. However, African Americans whose families could afford it attended the city's private, historically Black colleges and universities. Many of these educational institutions had academies or high schools as part of their educational offerings. In this way, John Hervey Wheeler attended Morehouse Academy, the secondary department at Morehouse College. Then he continued on as a student in the college department. At Morehouse College, John Hervey Wheeler majored in business, even as his true passion was playing the violin. And you can see him in the back middle with his violin. There's actually one story that one of his family members told me, it's not in the book, that there was during the 1920s, the Wheelers' neighborhood caught on fire, and all he could do was stand there helplessly in front of their house and hold tightly to his violin, right? So there's this image of this neighborhood burning. Their house didn't catch on fire, but he's holding tight to his violin. He played first violin with the Morehouse College Glee Club and Orchestra. He later credited his music professor, Kemper Harold, who you see standing in this picture in the front, for the, quote, discipline which you instilled in me and your effort to impress upon me the great value of thoroughness have been among my most valued possessions. I have consciously found myself avoiding the pitfalls of doing things in a slipshod or casual manner. As a student at Morehouse College too, Wheeler joined the student newspaper, the Maroon Tiger, as an assistant editor. He also wrote articles that hinted at his developing worldview. He wrote about the New Negro movement, college students and their relationship to religion, and provided cultural observations. John Hervey Wheeler's business professors at Morehouse College included Lorimer D. Milton and Jesse B. Blayton, who taught him economics and accounting respectively. And these two gentlemen would go on to become the officers of one of the other largest Black-owned banks in the country, the Citizens Trust Bank, located in Atlanta, Georgia, right? So he was trained by these bankers at Morehouse College, and those bankers, those mentors eventually become his colleagues in the world of Black banking later on. As his graduation from Morehouse College neared in 1929, John Hervey wrestled with a major decision about his future career prospects with two job offers. One, to become a music instructor at the famed Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama for $150 a month, or to move to Durham to become a teller with the Mechanics and Farmers Bank, making $60 a month. For many reasons, for obvious reasons, he ultimately decided on Durham. Wheeler's mother and father might have been influential in his decision to become a banker because they believe business to be the better and most logical option. Of course, his father, being an executive with the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company, held close ties to the Mechanics Farmers Bank because these institutions were sister institutions. The founders of the North Carolina Mutual founded the Mechanics and Farmers Bank, and so it made things a lot easier from the perspective of job security. And so during the 1930s is what I like to call when John Wheeler comes to Durham, he's a part of this sort of training ground in Durham, where he watched his supervisor at the bank, people like Charles Clinton Spalding, who's pictured here, and Richard Lewis McDougall, who I talked about earlier. He watched them in their business practices, but he also paid attention, and they also trained him in understanding this relationship to community. And so it's during the 1930s that he begins the wheels of his activism, which in many ways come full circle during the 1940s when he becomes education secretary for a civil rights organization called the Durham Committee on Negro Affairs, founded in 1935 by a group of African-American leaders, in many ways to challenge the local politics, to provide African-Americans with a better sense of accountability during the 1930s, during the Great Depression. And so John Wheeler is a part of this training ground, and he joins the ranks of, or he advances in rank, I should say, with the Mechanics and Farmers Bank during this particular period. After a few years, he became the assistant cashier at the Mechanics and Farmers Bank. By 1940, he is a cashier of the bank. And then in 1944, at the death of Richard Lewis McDougall, he becomes executive vice president and cashier at the Mechanics and Farmers Bank. And I guess I should note that the Mechanics and Farmers Bank had been chartered in February 1907. It began operations in 1908 and had a very gradual increase in terms of its resources to the point by the end of the 1920s, it's at around over $700,000 in resources. And in fact, during the Great Depression, when you have over 50 to 60 Black-owned banks in 1929 to only about a handful of banks by the end of the 1930s, around eight Black-owned banks, Mechanics and Farmers Bank is able to survive in part because a lot of its depositors were small depositors. They didn't loan a lot of money in terms of in large amounts. And also African Americans depositors didn't initiate any run on the bank like what happened to many of the both Black and white banks during the 1930s. In fact, the Mechanics and Farmers Bank and the North Carolina Mutual had record profits over a number of years during the Great Depression. Right. So John Wheeler is advancing in terms of his business career, but also in terms of his community activism. And I'm going to kind of leave the 1930s, and I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of this idea of Black business activism in the mid-20th century South. And I'm going to talk specifically about the 1960 sit-in movement. But before I get there, I should note that, again, especially thinking about yesterday being the anniversary of the Brown v. Board of Education decision that comes down with, from the Supreme Court, May 17th, 1954. During the 1940s and 1950s, John Wheeler again serves as the education chairman for an organization called the Durham Committee on Negro Affairs. And one of the things that happens is he's leading the way in terms of the fight for Black educational equality in Durham, but also in the state of North Carolina during this particular period. During the 1940s, as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People moves its legal strategy forward and wins case after case throughout the South. John Wheeler goes to law school during World War II. After World War II, he and other lawyers who you see pictured here initiate a lawsuit on behalf of Black children in Durham in 1949, the Blue v. Durham case, and they are successful. They win the case in 1951. A judge orders the local school board in Durham to bring schools for African Americans up to par with schools for whites, or up to par with schools for whites. And I should note that this is also at a period when the school legalization case had been very successful. And so the NAACP had built up its legal strategy in terms of setting precedent after precedent of these kinds of cases in the South. And just as this case had been won, the NAACP turned a corner in its legal strategy toward no longer seeking educational equality within the confines of the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, this idea of separate but equal, but they moved toward attacking segregation head on. And that's when you have Brown v. Board of Education. So the Blue case comes down right at the cusp of this particular period. The gentleman that you see pictured here, the second gentleman on the left, Oliver W. Hill, the gentleman on the far right, Martin A. Martin, they were legal partners with a law firm in Virginia that had been at the forefront in litigating these NAACP cases in Virginia during the 1940s, had been very successful. After they argued the Blue case, one of their very next cases was the Virginia school case that ends up as one of the 5 consolidated cases as part of Brown v. Board of Education. So I just want to sort of make a segue between the 1940s and the 1950s. John Wheeler is at the forefront in the fight for Black educational equality in North Carolina. The Blue case is one of the first successful school legalization cases in North Carolina, although it hadn't been the first to be initiated. And John Wheeler becomes this spokesperson for African Americans across the South when it comes to educational equality. As a lawyer, he had also been involved in filing a case against the University of North Carolina, which resulted in the first 3 Black undergraduates being admitted to the University of North Carolina. And that case also actually made its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And you see pictured here some of the civil rights lawyers from Durham in front of the US Supreme Court. And I'll just go through really quickly. On the left, this is Conrad Pearson. He had actually initiated some of the legal cases against the University of North Carolina in the 1930s to get African Americans admitted, although unsuccessful. This gentleman right here is Floyd McKissick. He becomes the chairman of the Congress of Racial Equality in the 1960s, also a Morehouse graduate and a lawyer, civil rights lawyer that was based in Durham. This is John Hervey Wheeler, and this is his wife, Selena Warren Wheeler, which you see pictured here. And so I just want to sort of give you an idea of what John Wheeler was really involved with, in addition to banking, this fight for educational equality as part of the Durham Committee during these 2 decades after World War II. So that by 1960, John Wheeler is the most influential Black power broker in North Carolina and among the top civil rights leaders in the South. And so what I wanted to do is kind of end with the 1960 sit-in movement. And so we're all familiar with February 1st, 1960, with the Greensboro sit-ins that really sort of launches the student movement in the South among African-American students across the country. A week after the February 1st sit-in movement, the sit-ins start on February 8th, exactly 1 week after the Greensboro sit-ins, Black student leaders in Durham and Winston-Salem began their own lunch counter protests. And those events soon spread to Charlotte and the state capitol in Raleigh. In Durham, students from North Carolina College, which is now North Carolina Central University, and a few white Duke University students participated in that day's protest at the downtown Woolworth store. When Woolworth's manager closed the store's lunch counter after a bomb threat. The students quickly proceeded to the Durham Crest. And when that closed, they moved on to Walgreens, which promptly followed suit. And so in the aftermath of the sit-in movements being initiated, state political leaders were very critical and very outspoken of the sit-in movement. And you all probably are familiar with that criticism being in part charges of outside agitators coming from outside of North Carolina into the state, forcing these kinds of protests. And they also point to trespassing laws. And so they're very resistant in terms of the ways in which they responded to the sit-in movement. After the sit-ins began in Durham, later that evening, the student protesters received legal counsel from attorney Floyd B. McKissick, who I showed you earlier, and learned then that they had the moral backing of the Durham Ministerial Alliance, the NAACP, and the Durham Committee on Negro Affairs. The support of these organizations was a complete 180 from what it had been just 3 years earlier in 1957, when a group of African-American students led by a pastor, Douglas E. Moore, a classmate of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s, he led a sit-in at a local ice cream parlor that led to the arrest of these students, but it didn't come with large-scale support by the traditional Black leadership, and so it wasn't a catalyst in the same way that you see the sit-in movements in 1960. John Wheeler had been a very active, obviously, in the sit-in movement, but the students were very familiar with John Wheeler. Just to give you an example, 2 months prior to the sit-in movement beginning in December 1959, John Wheeler traveled to apartheid South Africa and made it clear that he was not going to participate in this exchange program as a second-class citizen. He comes back to Durham, and one of the things that he does is he talks about his trip to South Africa with students at North Carolina College. You see some newspaper articles pictured here. The Mechanics and Farmers Bank had advertised also in a student newspaper. So the students, in many ways, were familiar with who John Hervey Wheeler was. And they were very familiar with an organization called, the organization I've been talking about, called the Durham Committee on Negro Affairs. By 1960, John Hervey Wheeler is the chairman of the Durham Committee on Negro Affairs. And the Durham Committee was a collective civil rights organization, similar to what you have with the NAACP, but it was a locally controlled organization and had a significant amount of political power in Durham and across North Carolina. And so one of the other reasons why he's at the forefront of Black politics, in particular in North Carolina. Durham city leaders, both Black and white, were accustomed to hashing out their differences through behind-the-scenes negotiations. Indeed, the white power structure called on the traditional Black leadership, including John Wheeler, to help quickly end the disturbances. Yet a carefully crafted public statement that John Wheeler put out as the Durham Committee chairman on Thursday, February 11th, 3 days after the Bull City began sit-ins, marked a departure from the way things typically played out. I can't read you the entire excerpt of that speech, but in part, he speaks to the role of the traditional Black leadership and its support. He calls out white moderates for not being aggressive enough. And then he points to the role of the student. So in his first excerpt, he says that the traditional leadership had an obligation to support any peaceful movement which sought to remove from the customs of their beloved Southland those unfair practices based upon race and color, which continue to be a stumbling block to moral and economic progress of the region. To those white moderates, he said in part, there were many thoughtful Southerners who believed such practices to be morally wrong and economically unsound. The South as a whole had not moved voluntarily toward eradicating such injustices as long as any vocal segment of the white population expressed its opposition. And he legitimized in many ways the student leadership. He said that they now emerge as a vital and strong group of stalwart citizens whose image of themselves is such that they are determined to accept no longer the inferior status which the South still sought to thrust upon them. And so, again, Wheeler expressed the Durham committee's strong support for the student demonstrators, again, it was a departure from what had happened just 3 years earlier when the community did not give its large scale support to another kind of direct action protest. This public support also came during the initial week of sit-ins before Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came to Durham, where he gave an uplifting speech and moral support to the Durham students. A week later, he gave this really arousing speech at the Black Durham, or at the White Rock Baptist Church, one of the prominent churches in Durham. So Dr. King, in the aftermath of the sit-in movement, or once they began, Dr. King, in this image you can see here, he and the Reverend Rafty Abernathy, their arrival to Durham a week later, after the sit-ins began, really gave the students some inspiration and gave them a strong push. Douglas E. Moore, all right, who I mentioned had led the Royal Ice Cream sit-in just 3 years earlier, had been a classmate of King, invited Abernathy to Durham on several occasions, but unsuccessful. And finally, King eventually made his way to Durham. That evening, when King spoke at the White Rock Baptist Church, that evening, King and Abernathy spoke to between 1,200 and 15 audience members at a rally at White Rock Baptist Church. Again, they gave very inspiring speeches. Don't have time to go through some of the excerpts of those speeches, but you've heard Dr. King's speech on many occasions. And so it was one of those kinds of speeches. Something interesting that I'd like to note about the King family and the Wheeler family was that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and John Wheeler had been acquainted with each other for years through their families. And in fact, John Wheeler and MLK regularly sat on or ran into each other regularly at meetings as part of the United Negro College Fund. John Wheeler was on the boards of trustees at Morehouse College and Atlanta University, had been on those boards since about 1935. Wheeler and MLK Sr. had actually attended Morehouse College together during the 1920s and had begun serving on the board of Morehouse College, or the elder King had begun serving on the board of Morehouse College during the early 1950s. So the Wheelers and the King families were well acquainted. And as a matter of fact, when Dr. King and Coretta Scott King come back to live in Atlanta around 1959 or so, maybe earlier, I can't remember the exact date, they actually move into the childhood home of John Wheeler. His father had died in 1957. He had moved his family, his mom, to Durham. And so the Kings lived in what was formerly the Wheeler home when they first came back to Atlanta, Georgia. And so in the midst of the sit-in movement, John Wheeler had in many ways embraced direct action years before, but direct action fit into Wheeler's idea of what I like to call freedom of movement, or how he articulated this idea of freedom of movement. It wasn't simply about the physical access, when you think of sort of what was gained by direct action protests, but it was also about what happened once African Americans gained that initial access. And he made the argument regularly that African Americans needed maximum as opposed and not minimal access in all areas. In the area of employment, for example, could a Black doctor expect the same staff privileges at a white hospital as a white doctor? Would that Black doctor be allowed to treat white patients? Could a Black banker employed by a white institution expect to rise through that company's ranks? Could they be president of that institution, or would their advancement be capped at a certain level? Would an industrial worker have the same open invitation to industry and to industrial employment or training or to promotion advantages that a white person would have? And so the direct action movement, the sit-in movement, fit in with Wheeler's ideas of freedom of movement. But I should note that John Wheeler felt that he operated from an integrationist framework, but he felt that integration had to be worked out in particular ways. And so freedom of movement from the physical standpoint was important in terms of the spaces that African Americans could go in terms of their freedom of movement. But he also was concerned about what happened once they got in, right? How much freedom of movement would they have in all areas? All right. All right. So one of the things that happened in the 1960 sit-in movement is local white leaders in Durham who were used to coming to the Black leadership to try to work out compromises. True to form, they come to people like John Wheeler to help end the sit-in movement. And there's a particular correspondence between John Hervey Wheeler and one of the white leaders, which I'll talk about. And I'll begin with a letter that the white leader wrote to John Wheeler. And he began by saying, quote, "You of all people must realize that there are some very real dangers in widening the gap which already exists between the two racial groups." And this is Watts Hill Jr., the gentleman who you see pictured here, who writes this lengthy 5-page letter to John Wheeler on March 17, 1960. Hill was a prominent white state legislator. He was also a banking and insurance executive in Durham, had written to Wheeler just days after a meeting, a meeting of leaders that Hill called disquieting. On Tuesday, March 15th, around 30 of Durham's white and Black community leaders gathered for a secret meeting that Hill had arranged, summoning the white leaders himself. North Carolina Mutual President Asa T. Spalding had the responsibility to gather Black leaders, who included Wheeler. And so they met in the familiar behind the scenes manner to discuss the increasing conflict arising from the February 8th sit-ins. And according to Hill, the meeting ended disastrously. In the margins of the papers, in the margins of the correspondence, John Wheeler scribbled in the right-hand margins. He said, quote, "This is a dangerous age. Danger cannot be avoided." And so throughout the letter, Wheeler responds line by line in the margins, and he defends himself against accusations that he and other Black leaders knew about the plans for sit-ins for quite some time. The Congress of Racial Equality, Hill argued, as represented by Mr. Gordon Carey, was in Durham and North Carolina College discussing this very situation, which faces us all today as long ago as June 1958. Wheeler wrote that during the 1950s, sit-ins were not on the horizon at that time. Evidence, please. And so I don't have any evidence that Wheeler picked up the phone and called or responded in his letter of his own to Watts Hill Jr. But it's so interesting the ways in which he actually responds in the margins of the paper. And one of the and so this is an example in this letter. This is an example of Wheeler's outright refusal to negotiate on behalf of the students because he felt that they were perfectly capable of negotiating for themselves. And this infuriated those white leaders in attendance, especially Hill, because they were so used to coming to John Wheeler to negotiate. And Hill, again, was the most vocal about Wheeler's position. And he made it his disappointment at how the meeting unfolded clear to John Wheeler in this confidential letter. And so in outlining his personal feelings as a self-proclaimed moderate, Hill felt slighted by Wheeler since the two had numerous extremely pleasant and productive conversations throughout the years. And Hill had been privy to John Wheeler and had learned a little bit from John Wheeler in their conversations. And he basically confessed that he wanted to provide John Wheeler with his most honest and true feelings. And so part of what he really points out in this letter is he points to some of what he calls these real dangers. And part of these real dangers was, one of them was a political backlash. This is amid the 1960 gubernatorial campaign in North Carolina, and also the presidential campaign between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. The political backlash from Hill's perspective was going to come when the moderate Democratic vote was going to be split three ways between Terry Sanford, Malcolm B. Sewell, and John Larkin against segregationist I. Beverly Lake. And he also felt that by the Black community endorsing and supporting the sit-in movement, it was going to basically turn white moderates like Hill against their support of the Black freedom struggle. All right, and so I know I'm running out of time. So one of the things that comes about is Hill points out that there was going to be this split within the moderate count of the Democratic Party during this gubernatorial election. And one of the interesting things is Hill writes Wheeler again about a month later, and we really get to what he was really interested in. He was really interested in getting Wheeler to support his candidate, Malcolm B. Sewell, who was the state attorney general at that time. He wanted Wheeler and the Durham committee to support and endorse his candidate. And so he writes Wheeler with all these kinds of scenarios. And he really tells John Wheeler that, my candidate can't come out in support of civil rights. He'll have to wait until after the Democratic Party runoff. And so he's noting that to Wheeler that we can't come out just yet. You have to give us a little bit more time. And then he says Terry Sanford isn't speaking out against Lake and his segregationist outburst. So give us a little bit more time. Well, ultimately, Hill's fears sort of come true. In the primary runoff that year, it was Terry Sanford, who you see pictured here with President John F. Kennedy, and I. Beverly Lake, who had been a staunch segregationist, and had been a law professor and also assistant attorney general in North Carolina during the 50s, during the Brown v. Board of Education decision. He had made some of the arguments on behalf of the state's attorney generals, arguing against Brown v. Board of Education being implemented in a fast pace rather than what we eventually got with this idea of all deliberate speed. All right, so Terry Sanford ultimately wins the Democratic primary against I. Beverly Lake. He had been able to sidestep this direct conversation about race by doing things like telling North Carolinians that he was going to give everything prayerful consideration. So he ends up winning. By the end of that summer, you had leaders from those lunch counter chains come to leaders in Durham. And so that by July 27th, direct action demonstrations aimed at lunch counters in Durham had come to an end. As part of this new agreement, lunch counters were to desegregate beginning August 1st. And so Durham joined other North Carolina cities like Winston-Salem, Charlotte, Greensboro, High Point, in desegregating its lunch counter sit-ins that year. And so during the 1960s, and I'm going to close, at the height of the modern civil rights movement, Wheeler was North Carolina's most influential Black Power broker and among the top civil rights figures in the South. Between 1957 and 1978, he served as the Durham Committee's chairman. In 1964, he became the first Black president of the Southern Regional Council, the Atlanta-based interracial research and publication civil rights organization that was also a national group that influenced policymakers in various ways. That same year, Governor Terry Sanford appointed him as the first Black delegate to represent North Carolina at a Democratic National Convention. He also held several presidential appointments in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, including an appointment to the President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity, which is a immediate forerunner to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And so Wheeler's civil rights activism defies traditional categories in very striking ways. The banker lawyer might be described best as a Black business activist, a suave tactician who skillfully demanded civil rights and full citizenship on behalf of Black Americans. His personal motto and favorite refrain was, quote, "The battle for freedom begins every morning," which meant that the difficult fight against racial injustice was continuous and should never stop, and that freedom was part of a larger goal that could not be won overnight. And so John Wheeler employed many tactics, including lawsuits and behind-the-scenes brokering, to press for equitable opportunities. And some of his tactics straddled the line between confrontation and negotiation. When the direct action phase of the movement was in full swing, he embraced the emergent student leadership and their organized civil disobedience as a tactic for obtaining racial equality and economic justice. He was more inclined than most Black businessmen to not only operate behind the scenes, but to also stand up publicly in the face of the white power structure. By the mid-1960s, he saw the battle for civil rights as having three distinct phases: the legal phase, the direct action phase, and the implementation phase. And he believed that the latter phase was especially uncharted territory and perhaps the most difficult to accomplish, as it dealt with eliminating institutional forms of racism. And so Wheeler led in many arenas, and he brought the full weight of his extensive institutional and organizational affiliations to bear in all of his civil rights activism. Though Wheeler wielded considerable power, he was limited in what he could accomplish because he relied on institutional and organizational support. Some might view him as too beholden to these established structures, but throughout his life, he counseled the best tactics are to work through the courts, become involved in politics, and use organized pressure. I'll end right there. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the Q&A session. Sorry, I went a little long there.
Oh, Brandon, don't worry about that. That's just fine. I think those of us who worked on did the introduction at the beginning went a little long, so it's not you, it's us. Thanks. Thank you. A few questions I'd like to ask from the audience, beginning with, does John Wheeler have any descendants, and are they involved in the financial arena or the civil rights movement?
Really, really good question. So John Wheeler has living a daughter. Her name is Julia Wheeler Taylor. And he has a son still living, Warren Hervey Wheeler. Interestingly enough, his daughter in 1983, she became the first Black woman president, or the first woman president of the Mechanics and Farmers Bank. So she was a third generation banker and bank president. She led the bank from 1983 to 2000 when she retired. And actually, I'm not sure if you saw the image toward the end of the courthouse. She's actually in that particular image. Maybe I can go back at some point. So she is kind of a pioneer in her own right in the field of banking when it comes to women in banking during this particular period. John Wheeler's son, Warren Hervey Wheeler, interestingly enough, during the 1960s, he becomes the first Black pilot. He becomes a pilot. He becomes the first Black pilot for Piedmont Airlines during the 1960s. He actually opens up his own airlines, Wheeler Airlines, that was open from late 60s or early 70s all the way through the 80s. So in many regards, like their father, they emphasize employment opportunities for African Americans. So he opened up the doors of aviation for a lot of African Americans in that particular field. So the daughter becomes a banker, the son becomes a pilot. And so in those areas, in terms of entrepreneurship, they open up the doors to employment opportunities for African Americans on multiple fronts. John Wheeler actually has a cousin who is in her 90s who is still living. I talked, wasn't too long ago, I talked to her daughter about the book, and they still have a lot of family actually who live in Kentucky. The cousin is located in Virginia. His younger cousin is actually located in Texas. And I also met two of John Wheeler's nephews. They were twins, and they told me that he was like a father to them. They're based in Atlanta, Georgia, and then he has a niece who is actually in New Jersey. So I've had conversations with his family. His family, they're everywhere still. His children are still living. They're both retired, and I'm I'm working on my next book on Black banking. So I'm trying to get more extensive interviews with his daughter. Yeah, it's a really, really great question.
Thank you. A couple of questions, please, just kind of reflections on then and now. One of the things that you pointed out is really a relationship between a business community and direct action. It must be interesting in your work to be doing it now at a time where we're seeing direct action again. And I'm wondering, are there parallels or just what's the sort of the compare and contrast answer to the relationship between business and direct action 60 years ago versus today?
Well, I think so. One of the ways to sort of think about that question is, I'll just give you an example. So last summer, with everything that happened with the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, we saw the wall come tumbling down with people's resistance to even saying Black Lives Matter. And institutions, my institution, I'm sure your institution, every institution, it seems like now are saying Black Lives Matter. And they're coming up with, we had a ton of statements, right? So there's a shift in how institutions in particular see themselves in addressing racial inequalities. And one of the things that often happens when this conversation comes out to the forefront, there is a argument about buy Black, in terms of African Americans. So economic empowerment becomes the sort of go-to, right? So you have these buy Black campaigns, you have these bank Black campaigns where economic empowerment is seen as a pathway to independence and citizenship, right? And one of the things that I always say is that this conversation about economic power in terms of what it is supposed to do for African Americans, right? It's only one particular pathway. In other words, part of what John Wheeler was really sort of fighting about was, this idea that you couldn't have economic empowerment until you had all of your citizenship rights. And I think sometimes we err in making the case that economic empowerment is the only way, right? When we know that everything from standpoint of public policies on down have played their part in widening the wealth gap and widening injustices that we see. And so I think economic empowerment is a strategy that is embraced, but I think we can't abandon all of these other sort of strategies and tools that we have. We have to sort of bring them all together, right? And work them out from that standpoint. Also, another response that you might be more familiar with is, particularly when it comes to banking, right? We had companies like Netflix, right, who pledged over $100 million to redistribute their funds to the tune of $100 million into Black banks. You have recently the establishment of what's called the Greenwood Bank, which is a fintech company started by one of the people who helped start it is Andrew Young, right? Ambassador Andrew Young, civil rights icon. Black banks are repositioning themselves to let their community know that they are still here and willing to do things like provide loans for African Americans to purchase homes. And so there's still this reciprocal relationship to banks like the Mechanics and Farmers Bank, which is still in existence, and the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Companies, these institutions which still are in existence. And part of what they've had to do, particularly speaking on Mechanics and Farmers Bank, is they've had to reassert their identity as Black-owned banks, as institutions who continue to have some concern when it comes to the citizenship rights of African Americans. So that's kind of one way to sort of think about that particular question, is to really sort of frame it around economic power being one pathway toward addressing these large-scale issues, but it is not the end-all be-all. And I think sometimes we point to it as the end-all be-all and kind of forget that there still is a role that the federal government has to play in terms of public policy. There are ways in which things like voting rights and legislation from that standpoint still have to be accessible in a way for African Americans and other constituencies to really sort of move things forward from a community standpoint.
Thank you. And a little follow-up question on that, because you've answered part of this question about the Mechanics and Farmers Bank of North Carolina Mutual, are still in existence. but also a little more about their successful strategy. And I can't help but think about the time that you're talking about. Banking was so different. We've had so much banking consolidation. Now, you know, you're talking about a banker who was based in North Carolina, and many of our banks are now North Carolina owned, actually. So the structure of banking has changed, and so the ability for that same sort of very community level activism. But so yeah, generally the question about their continued existence and strategies then, and how that plays out in a modern banking world.
Right. Well, I think part of the way to sort of think about that in answering is Durham, North Carolina had a lot to do with the success of both the North Carolina Mutual and the Mechanics and Farmers Bank, right? So in Durham, historically, right, you had a group of African Americans coming from the tobacco factory, who worked in the tobacco factories in North Carolina Central University, where you had a lot of African American professionals. And so Durham itself, again, Black Wall Street, this area that was thriving in terms of the support of these Black-owned institutions. And so I think part of their success was in the fact that well, first of all, when we think about sort of the tangibles of what it meant to be a Black Wall Street, in Durham, there were roughly 12 or more Black financial institutions that were interlocking, right, in terms of their boards of directors, so forth and so on. Mechanics and Farmers Bank historically it survived in part because I guess part of what I'm trying to work on now in my second book is to talk a little bit more about those survival strategies. And in part, the Mechanics and Farmers Bank, in terms of its practices, historically, it was very conservative in terms of its lending policies. It had very small depositors, so it never lent out a lot of money when you think of commercial, but so it was small depositors, depositors who had accounts to get lending in terms of consumer purchases, and it had some small scale lending in terms of businesses. But by and large, its operations were very, very small, right? The resources of Black-owned banks by by 1960, when you had about 14 African-American-owned banks, it was only about $48 million in resources, which in comparison to you having over 15,000 banks and over $176 billion in resources, it's not large from that particular context, right? But the small amount of resources that they had, they poured back into the community. These two institutions did not invest in communities, or did not take risks in communities where they did not have operations in place, right? And so they were very tight from that particular standpoint. Some people argue that when it comes to the North Carolina Mutual, after World War II into the 60s, it in some ways shifted its identity a little bit from identifying solely as a Black-owned company to thinking about itself and positioning itself toward the sort of larger marketplace, right? And so there's some things that it did successfully from that standpoint. But these were still small operations. One of the things that even after integration that John Wheeler did to ensure the bank's survival and to ensure that its practices sort of continued in the way that it did. In other words, to maintain its identity as a Black-owned bank, when stockholders, died or what have you, John Wheeler made sure that those who came in after those stockholders were African American. So he tried to maintain their identity as Black-owned institutions. Also, the idea of community banks was something that Mechanics and Farmers Bank really sort of bought into, and it was supported, right, through efforts of the federal government in a lot of ways. So there are a lot of ways in which we can sort of talk about the success of these institutions. But those are some of the things that we can sort of think about when we think about this sort of continued success. I've been very impressed with Mechanics and Farmers Bank because I've always thought about, okay, with Black banking in the 21st century, like what are these Black banks doing to survive and continue to move forward? And one of the things it really impressed me during COVID, it really sort of reasserted its identity. It made sure its customers and the community knew that, it basically gave literacy workshops to its depositors in the community to let them know that they could access Care Funds Act. They really did a good job during 2020 with COVID and everything.
Brandon, just two more questions and we'll wrap up. One's real short, and that's Rhonda Mangieri asked, you mentioned some of the colleges in Durham involved in the civil rights movement. My mother was a student at St. Augustine's University in the late 1940s and early 50s. Do you know if St. Augustine University students were involved in any of these movements?
Right. Yes, they were, definitely. I mean, and I don't know if I mentioned it, but with the Durham sit-ins, and I mentioned that it happened a week after Greensboro. So it's also Durham, it's also Raleigh, Winston-Salem, right? So St. Aug students were very much a part of those sit-ins, particularly in Raleigh. And I guess what I didn't mention was that, and a lot of people already know this, but in April of 1960, you have students who are African-American students who come to Raleigh, North Carolina. They convene on the campus of Shaw University, which is right there, not far from St. Aug. But these students come to Shaw University and form the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So the overwhelming answer is yes. And as a matter of fact, I don't write a lot about the student activism in Raleigh in my book, but there is a good book that was recently written by a historian named Jelani Favors. It's called, I think it's Trouble in a Time of Storm, Black Student Activism, historically Black, basically it's about historically Black colleges and universities. I'm messing up the title of the book, but an interesting book that really focuses in on historically Black colleges and universities. And there's a chapter on the sit-in movement in North Carolina, where he talks a little bit more in depth about some of that student activism, in addition to some of the classic works that many of you are already familiar with. Yeah, a great question.
One last question, and you obviously you've through your research had an opportunity to sort of channel John Wheeler, and so maybe it's a good way to sum up. If we can imagine that if John Wheeler were alive today, he would be invited to be on the Sunday morning talk shows and maybe cable in the evening. So if John Wheeler were a guest in our modern media world in such a show, what would be his message to America?
Well, I don't know if you, well, I read a quote, "The battle for freedom begins every morning," was one of his favorite quotes. And I noted, so if John Wheeler were here, he would be telling us the same message, right? There are issues that we are confronting and that we're dealing with. There are issues that we have dealt with. But once we deal with those issues and confront those issues, there are always going to be issues that need our attention, and that the battle for freedom begins every morning. So as soon as we deal with one issue, we got to get up the next morning and be prepared to tackle other issues, right? And so part of what he would say is that, in some instances, we've seen the kinds of challenges that we're facing now. We've seen them before, but our way out of those is to dig in our heels and attack issues from a multiplicity of perspectives, right? Whether we're talking about from an institutional perspective in terms of resources, in terms of access to those institutions, whether we're talking about changing the laws from a public policy standpoint, he would be an advocate of that. He will be an advocate of, organizing around the vote, right? So all these voter suppression laws that we're seeing, he would be organizing around that. And then also he would advocate joining in organizations that are doing the kind of work, right? And so he would approach it from a multiplicity of different perspectives with the understanding that we were always going to have to continue to keep our eyes and pay attention to democracy, right? And the ways in which democracy is an ongoing experiment, right? Something that we really have to continue to pay attention to, not rest on our laurels, right? So I think that's part of what John Wheeler would say. The battle of freedom begins every morning. Let's continue to work. Here are the ways in which we need to do that work, right? And he would be a model in terms of his activism. He would demonstrate to us how to go about attacking many of these issues. So that's how I think he would approach our contemporary moment, if you want to look at it from that perspective.
Well, Dr. Brandon Winford, thank you very much for being with us. And a reminder, the book is available from the University Press of Kentucky. They'll send it right to your doorstep and you can read a little more about this, but thank you for being with us from Tennessee. And so from Kentucky to Tennessee, hello and our gratitude.
Thank you all so much. Thank you all so much. I've enjoyed it. Yeah, and I'll continue to follow along to the work that you all are doing. So thank you for inviting me.
Great to be with you. Audience, thank you and good night.